Good morning. I have a great honor to open the first session of our colloquium, and the first speaker will be Professor Israel Bartal, who was connected with the Hebrew University and was a director of the Center for Polish History at this university. And I think that almost everybody read his books in Hebrew or in English. First of all, the book about Jews in Eastern Europe, and probably Poles and Jews, a failed brotherhood. May I ask Professor Bartal, who will talk about Polani, Galicianer, Litvak, Yeke, Ashkenazi, Changing Narratives in Israeli Collective Memory, 1882 till 2017.
Good
Please.
morning, everyone. Well, I start my talk exactly at the time when I was supposed to finish it. So it's a typical Israeli-Polish experience, I guess, part of our discussion. I would like to open my short remarks regarding the so-called Polish Ashkenazi claimed Jewish identity in Israel of today, with reading two paragraphs from a major, and I put it ironically, a major source on, if you like, current media images in the state of Israel. And I'm going to read from an entry in English written in Wikipedia. This is the way it's called in Hebrew, Wikipedia. One of them is the term Ashkenazi. And I read the first paragraph. In Israel, the term Ashkenazi is now used in a manner unrelated to its original meaning, often applied to all Jews who settled in Europe, and sometimes including those whose ethnic background is actually Sephardic. Jews of any non-Ashkenazi background, including Mizrahi, Yemenite, Kurdish, and others who have no connection with the Iberian Peninsula, have similarly come to be lumped together, this is a major word, lumped together as Sephardic Jews of mixed backgrounds. Jews of mixed backgrounds are increasingly common, partly because of intermarriage between Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi, and partly because many do not see such historic markers as relevant to their life experience as Jews. This is cited from Wikipedia, as I said, mid-February 2017, which takes us to something which is probably totally different from what you could expect from a veteran historian like me, and also from someone who subjectively has subjectively been involved in the shaping of, if you like, images of Israeli ethnic groups due to my long year activity in the committees on history curriculum in the state of Israel, in state schools and state religious schools together, by the way. So what I'm going to offer to you very briefly are 6 major points, and later on one could come up with a book based on those 3, if you like, opening remarks. And the bulk of the thing is actually, and I read my summary just to make sure that I complete my talk, before my 20 minutes are over. Polish identity, whatever it means, has reached today, in today's Israel, a phase when claimed identities in Israel are to become products of politics of culture, commercial or market powers, and mass media campaigns. this is my conclusion, nothing to do with the history of the Jews in Poland, either or with other major components that every one of us has in mind as a scholar or as a student of Polish Jewish history. And the other thing is actually, and this one of the 6 points I'm going to analyze in a minute, is that actually, surprisingly enough, in a very paradoxical manner, the so-called, in today's Israel, Ashkenazi identity is a product of a paradoxical, very complex process of going back to the pre-partition Poland identity of the Ashkenazi diaspora of the 18th century. Only in Israel, Ashkenazi diaspora, surprisingly enough, at least in the consciousness of Israeli society, had become again a unified community. A place where all those debates between so-called Ostjuden and Westjuden, German Jews, Polish Jews, Galicianer, Litvakes, whatever, everything you have in mind. In today's Israel, everything which is not Sephardi or Mizrahi is Ashkenazi, one and unified. Which means actually that we have to understand that 200 years of Jewish acculturation or partial integration into Polish culture and partially also in some segments of Polish society have totally failed to create a long-term separate Jewish identity, Polish Jewish identity. And if it did exist in Israel, it faded away, it disappeared. One of the major reasons for that is, of course, the fact that Polish Jewish identity in Israel had to stem from two sources, at least, that were almost absolutely lacking. One of them is a direct continuity of real demographic, social, political, economic, whatever, connections of the newcomers to Israel from late 19th century up to the present with their motherland, that is Poland. Due to historical reasons that I'm not going to enumerate because all of you are well aware to them, actually leaving Poland late 19th century, early 20th century meant for most of the Jews disconnecting from Poland. On the other side, of course, the Polish side, sides rather, had not shown any real interest or any drive to maintain such kind of connections with the people who left in large numbers, at least in the interwar period, and ended up in Palestine. And now for my 6 points. Point number 1, an ongoing struggle over claimed identities in Israel, a struggle that has been going on for almost 130 years, and a struggle that has been, in a way, shaping and reshaping time and again identities of subgroups, both internally and externally. The second point is the paradox I alluded to earlier, that the historical process that made the Jews from a pre-modern Jewish corporative society consisting of semi-autonomous communities, the way they used to exist in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the last decades of the 18th century, this pre-modern identity survived partially the era of the multi-ethnic empires, those empires that have partitioned Poland, but also it survived the era of the nation states emerging after World War I. But surprisingly enough, when newcomers to Palestine came from all those parts of pre-partition Poland, they maintained first in the early decades not their pre-modern Polish claimed identity, rather the newly acquired identity created by newly emerging political or geopolitical boundaries, the so-called Russian Jews. One of the major paradoxes that I have in mind, of course, as a historian of 19th, early 20th century, is the fact that all those Jews who came to Israel or to Palestine before 48 until the 50s were called or sometimes regarded themselves as Polish Jews. But all those Jews who came from the same territories 20 years later, from the 70s on, are called today in Israel Rusim, or Russian Jews. I have it in my family, you know. My grandfather and grandmother came to Palestine, they spoke Yiddish. My parents spoke Polish. The cousins who remained in the Soviet Union and survived after the Holocaust, and all of them, by the way, if they were living today, would have spoken probably Ukrainian because they are from Eastern Galicia, the so-called Western Ukraine, Zapadna Ukraina today, okay? So, but all of them are from the same family, but you have a generational kind of thing that all its components, all its segments ended up in Israel at the same time. And what happened later on, that after 30 years, after 40 years, and probably with the Russian case in the coming 30 years, we will have one unified, if you like, community that has no real clue to all those, if you like, earlier phases or stages just reminded. Same goes for other examples, but I'm not going to enumerate them. Point number 3. Immigrant societies regain identities long forgotten in the diaspora. This is what I called before the process of making the Polish Jews again Ashkenazi Jews. Now, surprisingly enough, what you have here is something which is unique for Israel as an immigrant society. And that is the fact that the newcomers were either required or voluntarily identify themselves with a process of cultural change. Many of them were kind of mobilized or kind of voluntarily mobilized themselves into a kind of a cultural nation-building process, which is well known for everyone who studies, you know, the emergence of modern Israeli Hebrew culture. Surprisingly enough, much of this had to do with ideas, with cliches, with images, with literary and poetic things of components of all sorts that were created in Eastern Europe, partially in Poland, and were brought to Palestine and were used in order to reject this Polish Jewish identity. But for other segments of Israeli emerging society, they were still identified as Polish. Okay, so surprisingly enough, today's Israeli modern Hebrew culture, the so-called in Hebrew pejoratively by some Israeli right-wing extreme politicians as Ashkenazi elites, actually, ha'elitot ha'ashkenaziot for you Israelis, okay, you love it, of course, our great Prime Minister and our great Minister of Education and our great Minister of Culture, okay, great people, of course, great minds. Please cite me, especially in Israel. Okay, for them, everything that has to do with this is Ashkenazi. Surprisingly enough, the new culture, partially invented, partially emerging spontaneously, that was created by newcomers, mainly from Poland or from partitioned Poland, if you like, is today identified with Ashkenazi. So when you go back to the Wikipedia citation I read before, that the term Ashkenazi today means nothing that has to do with the original meaning of the words. Now you understand what this gentleman had in mind, probably not understanding what he was talking about. Now, the fourth point, the impact of ideology and politics. Here, of course, since we are going to hear about school books and school curriculum in Israel, part of this nation building process, especially its cultural aspect, had to do with supplying Israeli kids, boys and girls, with ready-made images of, segments of the past, including the image of Eastern Europe, including the image of polyjury, things like that. Although we know today that much of it has no impact on most of the kids. Believe me, I'm an expert on that, being almost 50 years involved in curriculum. This is not exactly what shapes one's mind on one's past, or even its individual memory or collective memory, but still, this idea of creating, if you like, recommended type of memory of the past had an enormous impact on the image of Polish identity, or the Polish, if you like, components of emerging Israeli culture. Number 5, and this is the most difficult to explain, especially in a museum in the capital city of Poland. This is the impact of Israeli current ethnic discourse on the Polish identity. The growing impact of the ethnic discourse on the side of non-European Jews in Israel has made, actually, or has contributed enormously to this crystallization, or if you like, recrystallization of unified Ashkenazi identity. Okay? Because we have, first of all, we have a parallel process, also mentioned in this Wikipedia paragraph, that all the non-Ashkenazi group, at least in one's mind, or in some intellectual, if you like, invented presentations or images, rather, has to do with all unified Mizrahi identity. Hence, you have in Israel the paradoxical historical mixture of Bulgarian Jews, Iraqi Jews, and Yemenite Jews as one unified cultural community, which is, historically speaking, is more than nonsense. It's rubbish. Nothing true. Even the vernacular is not the same. Okay? But still, this is something that deserves still a careful study, by the way, and one of the major damages done to the study, the deep, real understanding of this phenomena is, of course, all kinds of left-wing, if you like, reformist, postmodern theories of all sorts that were mainly imported to the Israeli academia from North America, attributing to the very, very specific case of Israel, the theories on minorities in North America, for example, which is rubbish, believe me. I mean, I'm blunt, okay? And I'm known to be blunt in my country, so believe me. This is something that prevents us from really understanding the real complexity of this, but one of the issues is that when all those things ended up in Israeli politics and were mobilized by some politicians as, if you like, a unifying political slogan, this ethnic group, which is kind of totally invented and totally non-existing, except for in the minds of those who invented it, what happens to the other? And the other, believe it or not, is the Ashkenazi one, okay? Paradoxically, today, everything Israeli, everything, identified with modern Israeli Hebrew culture is Ashkenazi, while all the rest is minority. And minority means actually the majority in terms of Israeli population. And there's nothing that I could say more about it, except for the fact that we are still awaiting, of course, because historians, unfortunately, are not prophets, although most of them claim to be prophets. Okay, what will happen next? The last point I would like to make is the unique case of Israeli ultra-Orthodox segments of society and its contribution to another very interesting cultural phenomena in terms of maintaining a separate subgroup Ashkenazi community. Surprisingly enough, again, simultaneously with all those processes I have just described, in the ultra-Orthodox sector of Israeli Jewish society, dozens, if not hundreds, of subgroups are claiming a brand of pre-modern, sometimes pre-partitioned Polish identity. Of course, it's also partially, if not fully, invented. And surprisingly enough, they are claiming to be authentic heirs to traditional Polish Jewish society before the beginning of processes of modernization. Hence, the paradoxical phenomena that in Israel, in certain cities such as Jerusalem and Bnei Brak, you have Hasidic courts with names taken from Polish or Belarusian or Ukrainian shtetlach. You have Hasidic groups that stick to all kinds of minute, detailed, customs, minhagim, that are claimed to be 19th century, sometimes 18th century, customs. And in that regard, actually, one has also to be very interested in the vernacular. That is, part of them, not all of them, are still maintaining the dialect, or they claim to maintain the dialect. For all practical matter, it's not the original dialect, because everything is partially, if not fully, invented. But still, at the same time, one has to be very cautious to the fact that the only, if you like, social and cultural sector of Israeli society today that is described as continuity of pre-modern Polish identity or Polish Jewish identity is that sector. In some, actually, this struggle over identities that has been in recent years highly politicized, highly commercialized, and became in many ways part of Israeli public media debates is very interesting, is very intriguing, but have in mind that it has very little to do with Polish Jewish history of earlier centuries. Thank you.
I have a pleasure to introduce Professor Eyal Naveh from Tel Aviv, who is a specialist in the history of education, and also he wrote a lot of textbooks, Israeli textbooks. So we will listen to a lecture, Poland as a topic in Israeli history studies, curriculum, textbooks, extracurricular activities.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to me to be here. I'm not an expert on Polish Jewish history. In fact, I teach US history in the Tel Aviv University. In the last 15 years, I add to my expertise the issues of history education with the result of a lot of controversy that I was involved as a participant writing a textbook to the Israeli school system. I became a researcher, kind of a participant researcher, which ended in my last book that in your brochure say that it will appear this month, so it appeared 2 days ago and just came out of print in Hebrew. It will come in English later. So I think this is the place that you put me in to try to analyze a little bit the history studies from the history education point of view. I mean, I'm not analyzing the topic of Poland or Polish Jews in the academia or at the university, but rather at the moment that this knowledge is disseminated to the general public through all kinds of agent of dissemination, primarily formal agent, the Ministry of Education, curriculum, textbooks, and not less important informal and extracurricular activities. And in the case of Poland, I think it's very central when we discuss the journeys to Poland and this whole issue. History education is a discipline that involves history, the discipline itself, and its transformation. It involves education, but unfortunately, it involves politics. It is never a pure topic of history and education, because it's always within the context of politics, and I don't want to go into detail, you probably know. The small talk that I want to indicate is a top-down talk. I really don't know what's the image of Poland or Polish Jews in a class. It depends on the teacher, depends if he teaches at all, and then if he teaches, it depends on the students, and really, we really don't know. We know what the system wanted to be by analyzing the curricula, the textbooks, the approved textbook. Not every textbook can go to the system. I'm talking about approved textbook. By the way, I wrote 8. 6 had been approved, 1 was denied, and 1 created a lot of controversies and turmoil and was approved lately. So I'm in a position of observer participant. Another point of percussion is to say that I'm talking only about 1 system out of 5. In Israel, we have 5 formal systems of education. The state national system, the one that I will talk, that originally was about 65-70% of the classes, but now it's less than 40%. And we have other 4, national religion, system of education, ultra-Orthodox, called independent, which means no one can use to go inside, uninspected. Ultra-Orthodox system of education, Arab system of education, and Druze system of education. So we have 5 inspectors of history education in the Ministry of Education. I will talk only about the national state system of education that apparently became a secular, liberal, I don't know what it means exactly, system of education, which Israel Bartal was very instrumental in creating the last curriculum. And another point is to tell you that this system of education is now less than 40%, while the other are increasing. This is the only system of education that is diminishing year by year, so no one will know what will be the case 20 years from now in the conference that we'll do about this education. And also it's hard to evaluate the content, because the content is internalized the moment that the content goes to the matriculation exam. If it's not in the matriculation exam, it does not exist. So I can talk about a lot of books and a lot of chapters, no one read it, because the real story is, but not even the last year of history, the real story is the 3 months before the matriculation, when the teacher takes his yellow notebook and simply dictate the homer, the material for the education. And here, and this will be another reservation that we need to take into percussion. Nevertheless, saying all these things, I venture into certain sources that dealt with the issue. I checked curriculum, and in Israel we have many curriculum in history. It started in 1954, then somehow 1961, then the big one 1965, 75, and the last one is 1995, which is recently the curriculum that is taught, and with some sort of alternation in 2010. Discussing these issues, I focus on 5 major books that comprise about 45% of the market in the secular state system, which is the most indicative image that I can develop. And in a sense, what we can see here is that there are 4 major top aspects of Poland in the history school system. One is, this is the cultural and spiritual center of Jewish people. Second one, there is a chapter very interesting, both in middle school and in high school, within the topic of nationality among nations and in Israel, what you call inter-war Poland as an example of a failing democracy. So, and obviously the World War II, the Holocaust, and this is the major arena of events, but not the major topic of events. I will be more specific later. And now the fourth one, which is a kind of an extracurricular activity, but it became the most essential agent of memory, which is the school and army journey to Poland. So this will be the four topics, and I'll do it right away because I have only 10 minutes to finish it. So you'll forgive me. Yes, the first point, we're talking about it basically in the 8th grade. It's 4 hours out of 50, if someone really using these 4 hours. It hasn't changed too much since the first curriculum, basically describing the economic and cultural feature of the Jews within the Polish context. This is one of the pictures that I found in many textbooks that gives you kind of a relationship, no real qualification of what are the relationship, but then behind the subtext is suspicious, relatively, the early curriculum was detailed, focused on the development of the Jewish community, but also about the hardship of Jewish community within the Polish context, anti-Semitism, church propaganda. These are things that are in the text, but more than the text, if you translate the text, which is the early text, usually in the last curriculum, people don't have text. They have only pictures and subtitles next to the pictures. With the whole change of the disseminating a knowledge from a verbal knowledge to images, which someone can claim that it's bad, others will say it's good, but this is the fact. No one can avoid it. And you translate such a text to such a text, for example. I mean, this is the text that appeared in the really nice new books. So obviously, the anti-Semitics, the leader of the riots against the Jews, Chmielnicki, and even if you have this nice synagogue, the capture and the text that analyzes the synagogue, it somehow gives you a sense that the synagogue is more a fortress against impending attacks, that an ominous attack that obviously will come from the Poles. So this image is the image that is somehow inculcated to the mind of people before they even go to high school and to start to talk about real issues in matriculation exam. Yes, obviously within this text you have the development of Jewish life, meaning spiritual development, and this is obviously part of it. But then it is not to the exam, as people say. It's before the exam, elementary school, middle school, but not high school. When you go to high school, in fact, you don't have all these things in the mandatory exams, unless you take history as a major that only less than 1% of the people are taking history as a major. The mandatory exam does exclude this issue. The mandatory exam is started with Poland in the interwar period, and here Poland appeared as the ultimate failure of democracy, together with Italy. Democracy that collapsed, although you have, Pilsudski, and there is some positive attitude toward Pilsudski, but usually at the same page or maybe page after it, reason for the failing democracy in Poland, severe economic hardship, demographic complexity, non-Polish minority, German, Russian, Jews, and obviously lack of democratic social structure and cultural legitimacy. So when the student, in fact, study on Poland is kind of an alien place, failing place, non-democratic place, things like that. Within this place, obviously, there are Jews, and Jews are 10% of the Polish population, and the emphasis is basically on Jews who did not assimilate to the Polish society, either by being ultra-Orthodox or by being nationalist, Zionist, Bund, and in that it reinforced the image of this ultimate other or problematic other of the Polish society. When it continues, it has also the relationship, which basically emphasized after the end of Pilsudski regime, the last year of the 30s, just prior to the World War II. So when the students enter World War II, they already have this somehow slightly negative image of the arena where Jews were concentrated, namely the Polish failing democracy who became dictatorship. Obviously, the third point and most important one is the point of World War II, the Holocaust. And this is a very central part of the Israeli school system. 30% of the material is by mandatory part of the matriculation exam, although these 30% are not imposed by the Ministry of Education through exam. It gives every school the right to develop their own exam on this 30% section of the material, which made it very interesting. It's, people do it in various ways. But by and large, you see Poland here. Poland, World War II. Poland is the arena of event. It's not the topic of study. It's the place that event took place, and the events are tragic, terrible, catastrophic, and you name it. I mean, there are some very graphic pictures. Obviously, they create the event. I mean, but you have these images surface in the textbooks very clearly, and most of the teaching of material is ghettos, suffering, deportation, and the trend to the final solution, the death camps, Majdanek, Treblinka, Auschwitz, large as a ghetto, deportation, things like that. So there's no real talk between Poles and Jews, but rather this is the context where this terrible crime against Jewish nation perpetrated by the Germans took place. Except one chapter, which is very interesting, and this is the chapter of the Polish involvement, the chapter that is being learned in the Holocaust within the context of World War II and the nation's attitude to the Holocaust. And here you have a more specific chapter that deals with Polish-Jewish relationship during this time. And to sum it up to 4 points, the Poles are mainly regarded as passive, couldn't help or didn't want to. There are few cases in the Israeli textbooks that they are seen as supporters on collaboration with the Nazi horrors, and other few places where the Poles are rescue action, and almost recently emphasized. By the way, very interesting, what is not written there, not even one reference to the Warsaw uprising. Very interesting. Israeli students did not, they know that there was a ghetto uprising, but they came here to Warsaw and they not know there was a Warsaw uprising. It's very interesting to see it. Not in even one textbook, including mine, we didn't mention the Warsaw uprising. Very interesting also. Anyhow, I don't know if I have time to give you the text that for me summarize this complex picture of Poles, because I'm right. But this is a text that shows you the complexity. I mean, there were relationship from the beginning. They have a tensions relationship. This relationship at the end of the Holocaust create all kind of collaboration with the perpetrator by Polish peasants. Yet among them there were some people who risked their life and saved Jews. But by and large, most of the society is perceived in the Israeli school system as either bystander or collaborator, or other victims, but not dead victims like the Jew. By the way, the victorious victim notion is very central in all Israeli textbooks. So at the end, there are mention of some rescuer, Żegota, and obviously Righteous Among the Nations section is filled with individual examples of Poles. Which leads me to the last point. I mean, after having this kind of education, these young people go to Poland. And when they go to Poland, they have this baggage of information on their shoulder. And in good places, there are a lot of workshops that prepare them to Poland and try to problematize this baggage. Other will simply go on with it. So the March to Poland also have certain stages. The first stage is this victory parade, March HaChaim, a life parade, which means we are here on the Polish ground, we are back here. Israel is the answer to the diaspora, kind of a discrepancy between there and we. And it was the first stages of, by and large, not everyone, but the first stages of the march of the journeys to Poland. And then later, there is a lot of new component that had been added, going to Jewish heritage, which means that here you have a component not of break, but rather of reconnection, restructure, rebuilding. And in the last time, there is some sort to talk with Polish life, not necessarily Jew, kind of a normal life, to have some common meeting with Polish youth, parties, evenings, things like that. So these are aspects of the march that have a lot of ramification. Maybe in the discussion we can discuss it, because I have only 1 minute remain. I would like to add one element to these marches starting from 2000, which means that the army parade somehow is adding to the to these journeys. Witness in uniform, kind of a project in the army that almost every officer in the army in some time of his life will go to this process of going to Poland, and it had its own impact. I think very great impact on history education. Create a lot of controversies, a lot of problem, a lot of debate. What is the meaning of this parade? What does it mean to fly above Auschwitz with aircraft? Is it legitimate? Is it not? But by and large, it is still there. And lastly, there is a combination between the army and the school journeys to Poland, which for me is another indication of this identity fusion that Poland served as an arena for this, creating a good patriotic Israeli young who are in the rite of passage will later become Israeli soldier. And in that sense, you have a very functional role of the march of the journey to Poland within the history education system that can be also discussed and analyzed and make the impact. To sum up, I don't want to make any conclusion in this talk, just to open some sort of insight to further conclusion. I told to those who read Hebrew, I hope you will find some of the conclusion in the book that it just appeared. Those who are in English will wait till I will change into English speakers. It will take a few years. But by and large, I try to show in this small talk the potential linkage between the Israeli identity and the Polish Jewish and the Polish background as an arena that somehow contribute to the fostering and transforming of this identity. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The last speaker at this session will be Dr. Hanna Węgrzynek, who is actually who works at Polin Museum. She's a historian doing research on the history of Polish Jews in the pre-modern times, and she was also involved in some projects devoted to the presence of the history of Polish Jews in Polish textbooks.
I'm a historian working mainly on Jewish history in Poland in 16th and 17th century, but I'm also author of several analyses devoted to Polish textbooks. And today I'm going to speak about the beginnings of Polish educational system, and I would like to present how this period was important for teaching about Holocaust in Polish schools. On the June 1943, based on the decision of the Soviet Council of People's Commissaries, the Committee for Polish Children in the Soviet Union, Kompoldiet, was founded in Moscow. The organization's main task was to create a system of child care for Polish children in the Soviet Union and to provide them with school education. Within the course of only 6 months, over 100 schools were set up, and curricula and textbooks for them were urgently needed. The task of preparing them was handled by the Department of Schools, Curricula and Publication, headed by Zhanna Kormanova, Łódź-born leftist activist and well-educated and with teaching experience. After the outbreak of the war, Kormanova escaped to the Soviet-occupied zone. She completed a course of the recent history at the Teachers' Improvement Center and became familiar with the Soviet education system. She was brought to Moscow as early as July 1943 by Wanda Wasilewska, head of the Union of Polish Patriots, as responsible for developing the textbooks for Polish children. On the Kompol Diet, Kormanova was responsible for all aspects of schools education. The allotment of teaching hours for different subjects, general teaching programs, and detailed curricula. Her first publication on the subject approved as early as 1943. It is difficult to say to what extent she was independent. The deputy chairman of the Kompol Diet, Stanisław Skrzeszewski, was also a teacher. And his wife, Bruche Bronisława Mendelbaum-Skrzeczewska, the editor of Kompol Diet publication, was a historian. Kormanova had professional contacts with Soviet historians. Nevertheless, all the publications concerning the teaching system and program were assigned with Kormanova's name. History was to be an important subject in the curriculum of Polish schools in the Soviet Union. It covered three areas: the history of Poland, general history, and the history of the Soviet Union. Kormanova knew that it was necessary to refer to current events, in particular to explain the changing role of the Soviet Union in Second World War, from a German ally in 1939 to a member of anti-Nazi coalition. That was why she decided to extend the history curriculum to 1943. Already in her first publication, written at the beginning of her work for the Kompol Diet, she had touched on the subject of the Holocaust. In an article entitled School Textbooks and Programs, published in 1943, she wrote, I quote, "The readings would not fulfill their basic task if they didn't mention the great plight of the German occupation, the destruction of the country, and persecution of the people, bestial treatment of Jews." She developed this notion in detailed program for teaching history, which was approved for publication in July 1944 and published in Moscow soon after. It covered the history of Poland from the Middle Ages until 1943. Topics relating to the condition of Poles in occupied territories included a large section entitled The Tragic Fate of Jews in Poland, which discussed topics such as racial legislation, the creation of the Jewish ghettos in Warsaw, Łódź, and Lublin, the bestial extermination of the Jews, the tragic fate of heroic defense of the Warsaw ghetto. It is not clear what exactly was to be communicated to the students within the scope of each of these topics. The content was probably developed in the textbook Materials for the History of Poland, which Kormanova worked on at the same time as that curriculum. The text was sent to the censorship office in Moscow in May 1944, but it wasn't printed, probably because of negative decision of the censors. Meanwhile, in 1944, in Moscow, the Union of Polish Patriots published the first historical study devoted to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, written by Bernard Mark at the time a Union of Polish Patriots activist, and after the war member of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland, and later a long time director of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The efforts initiated by Kromanova, particularly the curriculum she developed, were very influential. They pointed to the need to write and teach about the Holocaust. Moreover, they had obtained the consent of the Soviet authorities. It is significant because school textbooks in the Soviet Union were silent on the subject of the Holocaust and presented the fate of Soviet society as a whole, without this distinction of ethnic or national affiliation. It is hard to say why Kromanova believed it is necessary to include discussion of the Holocaust in the school's curricula. One could presume that she was simply being accurate as a historian. Yet it is hard not to notice that she also had personal reasons. Kromanova seldom spoke about her Jewish origins or on the fate of her family. Only brief mention of the subject survive in the curriculum vitae written in November 1942 in Soviet Union. Kromanova explained that she couldn't not remain in Nazi-occupied Warsaw because of the communist views and Jewish background. She writes that her mother had been thrown out from her flat in Łódź in 1939, and her sister found herself in the Soviet zone. Kromanova underlines that she has not heard from them since June 1941. She states emotionally, I quote, "I don't know if my mother and sister are still alive." She concludes in other version of her curriculum vitae written in Lublin in 1944 with the words, I quote again, "Fascism destroyed all my loved ones. I buried my husband in Stalingrad." But there is not mention in all this curriculum vitae about ghettos or mass extermination in Poland. In October of 1944, Kromanova received permission to travel to Poland, to territories liberated by the Red Army. She worked for the Polish Committee of National Liberation, initially in the publication department and then in the program department of the Ministry of Education. She had probably been recommended by the former deputy director of Kompol-Diet, Stanisław Skrzeszewski, and now the Minister of Education. Other Kompol-Diet activists were also among the higher-ranking officials involved in the setting up the communist education system. The continued work began in the Soviet Union and used the materials developed there. What is important, they consulted Jewish topics with the activists of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland. Ready projects were sent to the Soviet experts for commentary and approval. New curricula were implemented in schools in 1946. They comprise topics related to the Holocaust, although these were presented in much more general form than in the Kompol-Diet materials. Nevertheless, under similar headings, I quote, "The fate of the Jews and the defense of the Warsaw Ghetto." This formula will become a fixed part of the school's curricula in the Polish People's Republic and even in the Third Polish Republic. The Holocaust was initially marginalized as a subject. It couldn't be passed over the silence because it was a known historical fact, and because of the binding decision made earlier in the Soviet Union. But there was also a desire not to give prominence to it. For this reason, the Holocaust was used as an introduction to the main topic, namely the martyrdom of Poles. The interpretation clearly led to false statement, the most serious concerning the nationality of victims. In the Polish People's Republic, history was taught from grade 4 for elementary schools. Initially, the program covered the history of Poland and general history until the outbreak of the Second World War. And at the same time, a new subject was introduced in the grade 7 of elementary schools and in supra-elementary schools, Poland and Contemporary World, which also covered Second World War, including the Holocaust. The first Poland and the Contemporary World textbook appeared in 1948. Its author, Władysław Bieńkowski, was a deputy minister of education and member of Central Committee of Polish Workers' Party. The textbook was addressed to wide audience, teachers, education activists, and university and high school students. Bieńkowski devoted about 40 pages of text to Second World War, but only a short paragraph to the fate of the Jewish people, and stressed that, and I quote, the extermination of Poland's Jews was a prelude to the biological extermination of Polish nation. Extermination camps were further mentioned without saying who their victims were. Only Treblinka was clearly cited as a place where Jews were exterminated. The period of creating of new historical canon, both in terms of methodology and interpretation of events, ended in the early 1950s. The changes were summed up at the first methodology conference of Polish historians, which took place in Otwock in December 1951. A few months earlier, in the summer of 1951, the first publication for teaching Second World War history had come out. History of Poland, published as supplementary materials for history teaching with a print run of 600,000 copies, and History of Poland 1864-1945 for secondary schools, print run 60,000 copies. Żanna Kormanowa had edited both books. We may say that they were her way for accomplishing her plans from the Commonwealth period. The most detailed discussion of the fate of Poland's Jews appeared in the high school textbooks History of Poland 1864-1945. An extensive passage, about 3-4 pages in length, in chapter Hitlerite extermination policy, the rise of the resistance, was devoted to the Holocaust. Students could find out about seizure of Jewish property, the creation of the first mass extermination camp in Kulmhof, and about Auschwitz, which started as a labor camp and evolved into a death camp. The book contained extensive discussion of German policy toward Jews after Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union. It also contained information about the Wannsee Conference and subsequent German action to exterminate the Jews starting in July 1942, the creation of other death camps, the fading of Warsaw Ghetto in January 1943, economic exploitation of Jewish labor by German companies, and Himmler's decision to raze the Warsaw Ghetto to the ground. Leaving aside the description of assistance provided to the Jewish resistance by the Communist Polish Workers' Party and the language of narrative itself, it was the most complete account of the Holocaust found in the Polish communist era textbooks. And even in the period of the Third Polish Republic until 1997. This, however, doesn't mean that the fate of Jewish population overshadowed the experience of Poles. Poland and Contemporary World and History
textbooks from the late 1940s and early 1950s presented similar interpretation of the events of the Second World War. Their basic aim was to show Poles as the main group of victims of the Nazi system. The fate of the Jewish people was only a background for emphasizing the Polish martyrdom. Bienkowski wrote, I quote, "The crimes most affected our nation, which the Nazi leaders had destined for a complete annihilation." This interpretation served political aims. The authorities wanted to convince Polish society that Poland had a single enemy during the Second World War. That means Germany, which still constituted a real threat as the Federal Republic of Germany. This enforced an image of the Soviet Union not as an aggressor from 1939, but as a liberator and a guarantor of Polish borders. Such an interpretation left no room for discussion of the Holocaust. The subject was either passed over in silence or marginalized. Kurmanova was an exemption to some extent with her consistent efforts to introduce young people to the martyrdom of Poles and the extermination of Jews alike. The textbooks History of Poland 1864-1945, which she edited, can be credited with the fact that the Holocaust did not disappear from the history curricula in the Polish People's Republic. In Polish historiography, this textbook has come down as a book of shame. But in the history of the Holocaust education, it became a guardian of memory. When after the political changes in Polish October in 1956, the excessive curricula were abridged, content pertaining to the Holocaust was reduced to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and we can discuss why at that time the topic of the Holocaust wasn't disappear from the schools. Because many other topics were omitted. For example, the Soviet attack on Poland in September of 1939. It was probably because the subject had been presented in Polish schools since the beginning of the Polish People's Republic, even though it wasn't the most politically convenient one. It persisted thanks to a group of communists for whom the Holocaust was an extremely important event, and also for personal reasons. And there is a second important aspect. The monument to the ghetto heroes, erected in Warsaw in the spring of 1948, amid the rubble of the former ghetto, also contributed to the presence of the Holocaust in Polish textbooks. For many years, it towered over the ruins of the former Northern District and present-day Muranów, becoming a monumental document of the history. Thank you for your audience.
Thank you very much. And as you noticed, we have like 5 to 10 minutes for discussion. Because
Professor Naber's presentation, very interesting. Obviously, you can't say something about the ultra-Orthodox curriculum, since this is not accessible, but could you say something about the national religious curriculum and how far it differs from what you described? Or maybe Israel can do that.
So maybe we got some questions.
Well, as I said earlier, I was involved also with the school curriculum of national religious high schools. And surprisingly enough, both curricula, that is the state school curriculum and the religious state school curriculum, are almost the same.
As usual, we don't agree. I know. He is right. Till the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, there is a new NGO, Amutat Har Bracha, which is an intention to separate the two curriculum in order to introduce to the national religious curriculum more divine-oriented, religious, less modern, less Zionist, more in tune with the new Minister of Education direction. So Israel is talking really about the formal outcome, which is still relatively similar, but I think sometimes we should to go to informal outcome, which is in the last time, and I have a student who is doing his PhD on this, how the National Religious School is moving towards more and more ultra-Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Zionism, Chardal, which means that they want to have their own particular curriculum, which is totally different from the general one that is tamed by the National Religious as post-Zionists.
Well, this is actually a typical thing. We agree, but you are talking about one trend, and there is an internal debate within this education system to show you how similar is Poland to Israel.
I just want to add something to Professor Neve, that is also the same trend that you are talking about, also can recognize with all the preparation for the school journey. Also, a lot of religious NGO organizations are getting into the system, and their emphasis and everything on the journey is totally different from the government system and the journey. So it's a whole different.
Yes, and the other side of the coin that many secular Tel Aviv Bible-oriented people are using non-statement NGO, but rather private left-wing NGOs, emphasize human rights rather than patriotism. For example, I reveal myself, my daughter refused to cover herself with the Israeli flag in Auschwitz. So the whole idea is a privatization of memory as part of the new trend of Israeli society.
I was quite surprised in the presentation of Professor Nave when seeing that there is almost 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history almost missing in Israeli curriculum. And we had it in Poland as well, and we see that it always leads to a lot of curiosity among young people, because people need continuity. So the sense of that there is something missing. This is why they are starting exploring the Jewish heritage of where they live and so on. Do you observe something similar in Israel, that something is missing and that young people start to?
Yeah, I think, I totally agree. It was missing till the 90s, totally missing. I grew up with this gap, and now it's start to reconstruct. By the way, I think Israel make a fantastic job in starting to reconstruct. I didn't emphasize it in my last slide or one before. I mean, the move from to see the rubbles and the missing is now toward to see the heritage and to recognize these 1,000 years of black hole that we need to fill. So this is a new trend that is starting. Not, I don't know how to measure it and evaluate, but this is a trend, you are right.
Surprisingly enough, in the old school curricula, until the 60s and 70s, it was there. And then it disappeared, and then it popped up again in the 90s. Okay, so it's much more complex.
It disappeared because basically Zionist image of breaking with the diaspora, breaking with the heritage, breaking, the creating of this new Hebrew, out of nothing or out of biblical time, but within this gap in between.
Another question by Professor Poloński.
This morning, in our guided tour, many people went on it. The role of the ZZW, ZWZ, as opposed to the job, was discussed. This is, of course, one of the complaints we had at the museum about the failure to show the revisionist contribution to the Warsaw Uprising. How is this reflect this particular controversy, in which essentially I have to say the old historiography is more correct than the new historiography? How far is this reflected in textbooks?
Very little. I can tell you just from a personal experience that in my textbook I have 3 sentences on the Etzi, on the revisionist, which is a great transformation from the other that were totally disappeared. So I think it is there, but not to the point that it entered the school system. Basically, the controversies that are in academia and the memorial site and museum filter education one generation later. Education is always behind, and it starts.
In regard to Professor Nover's presentation, I was a high school teacher until 2005, I think. I taught history, mainly in the religious, national religious high schools. And I must admit that with all due respect to curricula and textbooks, it most depends on the teacher at the classroom. You said in your presentation that what matters is the 3 months before the matriculation exams, right? I myself remember myself coming to the class at the first time of the year, telling my students, listen, these are the books you should read for the matriculation exam. Now close the books and let's talk history. And this is exactly what we did. And these students were very interested in all, the missing parts of the textbooks. So I would give a lot of credit, not to me, but to most teachers who are much more clever, I would say, than the guys who controlled, better than others. Yeah, what's written in these textbooks.
Yes, as I mentioned, I mean, at the end it depends on the teacher, but unfortunately there is a system, there is a habitus. There is some sort of habitus which prevent most of the teachers to have this independent initiative as you have. Not all the teachers are like you. And we need to talk about, the level of the general teachers, and I'm more familiar with the state system than the national state system. The general attitude is that many teachers are afraid to take these independent steps. And you know it.
So let me ask the question about this Israeli excursion to Poland. How do you think this excursion will be continued, or what is the attitude in the Israeli governmental circles about this? Because they are also very much criticized.
Well, a big topic. Basically, among governmental attitude, it will increase and intensified and became the real history. But there's a big debate now because so many people who have no financial sources to have this exertion, so it creates a big debate whether these exertions are not intensified clashes in Israel, and only the privileged can do it and the underprivileged cannot. But on term of content, it will intensify, it will increase, it will become the real rite of passage. The army is there. Personally, I am not very happy with this trend, but this is one trend. And another trend is, as I told you, it is privatized. I mean, many NGOs decided that for their own kids, they want a different exertion. They want a different journey. They go to liberal, some of them even non-Zionist organization. There is an Arab Jewish exertion in the bilingual schools that emphasize different things. So like every other thing, there is privatization of history and memory and history education, which is part of the trend as well. But it will increase, no doubt about it.
So thank you very much. And the discussion will take place in the corridor, please. We invite to the coffee.